In Azure API Management, API providers can change API behavior by configuring policies. Policies are a set of statements expressed in XML, and those policies they are executed on API gateway to perform actions on API requests and API responses. Today in Azure API Management, there are over 60 built-in policies for rate limiting, for content validation, for authentication, and other horizontal tasks. And while being extremely valuable and powerful, those policies they take time to learn and they take effort to configure. Microsoft Copilot for Azure makes working with policies more productive and flattens the learning curve for new users. Let me show you how it works. So here I'm in the Azure portal and in the API policy section of API Management in the policy editor. And let's imagine I'm a new user and I don't really know what the policies are. I can click this Copilot button and I can ask Copilot to tell me what Azure API Management policies are. And Copilot tells me that policies are a collection of statements that are executed on request or response of an API. Now I have this simple API imported to Azure API Management. There are two things I want to configure for this API. First, I want to remove ASP.NET version header from the response. And the second thing is I want to implement rate limiting for this API. Let's use Copilot for that. First, I will ask Copilot to generate a policy with a rate limit of 5 requests per minute. I can copy this policy snippet into my configuration file. Next, let's ask Copilot to generate a policy to remove an ASP.NET version header from the response. Now let's copy this policy snippet into my configuration, save the API, and see how it works. Now when I do a test request one more time, you can see that I don't have ASP.NET version header anymore. Let's send a couple of more requests to see if we have the rate limiting in place. Great, we have all policies we need, and those policies were generated using Microsoft Copilot for Azure. Now, let's imagine a different scenario. I'm someone who is already familiar with Azure API Management, but I have this API which was handed over to me, and I want to understand what's configured in the policy for this API. And while I understand the validate JWT section, I don't really know what this validate GraphQL request does, so let's ask Copilot to explain it to me. And as you can see, it not only explains what the validate GraphQL request policy does in general, but also provides description for a specific example that we have here. So it shows that we have a maximum size of 100 kilobytes configured for any incoming GraphQL request. We have a maximum query depth configured, and so on. It also says that we have this authorization section, which is used for request authorization. And the first rule that we have in that section is used to reject any request coming to /double_star. But the thing is that it also describes it with the GraphQL context in mind, saying that this is something which is typically used to block access to GraphQL introspection queries. And that is extremely useful to me because I'm not that familiar with GraphQL, but now I understand that this is an important configuration from a security standpoint. And the second authorization rule, which is fairly complex expression, is also explained pretty well. It says that this rule checks if the request is trying to access a specific path, and if so, checks if there is an admin claim in the JWT token in the context variable. And this saves me a lot of time digging through documentation on how to combine validate JWT and validate GraphQL request policies. Now let's imagine a third scenario. I'm currently migrating from another solution, and I have this Apigee configuration which I want to convert into API management policy. This configuration adds an additional header to the response of my API. So let's see if Copilot can convert this for me. Okay, looks good. Let me copy this into my configuration, save my policy document, and test the API. And we should be able to see a new service header which says hello from API management. Microsoft Copilot for Azure not only speeds up the ramping up process for those who are new to API management, but also boosts productivity for those who work with API management on a day-to-day basis, and also helps those who are migrating from another solution.